Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to kick off this session. I apologize for the delay that we had in terms of setting up the scene, but it's going to be a very interesting panel that we are bringing here together, and I would like to welcome you all very much to this session. Ladies and gentlemen, this session is about the future of ecology. How are we working towards and enhancing environmental protection on the entire planet, I think. And we will be discussing here with our panelists some of the key points that we have seen emerging or adapting or changing as we speak about environmental protection and ecology now since more than 30 years. My name is Gino van Begen. I'm the Secretary General of ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability. We work on sustainable issues with more than 1,700 cities around the world. And I must say that since we have started to work on sustainability, indeed the definition as well as the policy making around sustainability has drastically changed over the last 30 years. For us, we would think that sustainable development is a development path that needs to be based on low emissions, that needs to be resilient, that needs to be based on nature-based solutions, that needs to be circular, and most importantly, that needs to be people-centered and equal. So, having said that, I will kick off now the session here, and I would like to invite Dr. Shannon McDaniel, Director of the Data Strategy of the Global Covenant of Mayors Secretariat in Brussels. And Shannon, let me just, from your perspective, in particular the Global Covenant of Mayors, for those who are not necessarily familiar, it is an initiative, an alliance of many networks coming together, pushing our cities to take very active action in the climate sphere. And it is in that sense that climate emergency has become definitely a topic on the agenda of many city councils and local leaders around the world. So, Shannon, if I can just ask you to respond on how do you see from a GCOM, from a Global Covenant of Mayors perspective, how do you see climate emergency arising actually, and how did it happen? What are the reactions to it, and how is it being taken up, and what does it maybe also means? Shannon, please.
Thank you, Gino. Thank you for having me today, and welcome to everyone. The climate emergency declarations that have been occurring, we see them as a real avenue for action for our cities. So I think it's agreed and understood that we are in dire circumstances. The citizens of all cities around the world recognize the climate is changing, the impact has been great and seems to be increasing. And the beginnings of that, for really bringing political and social attention to the emergency that we're facing, started by some cities making declarations. So we developed at GCOM a toolkit so that cities could use that information in a formatted way to help convey those messages to the citizens. We believe that in order for cities to be very active and supportive and find the right path forward in communication, that there needs to be a process in place for that information to go out to not only the citizens but to the world, that everyone is now moving and mobilizing at a local level to bring attention to the crisis that we're facing at hand. So with GCOM, we developed a toolkit that would allow cities to have something already put in place to help them use some of those tools and resources as made sense for their local circumstances. The term emergency and climate emergency is very powerful, and it makes a lot of sense in a lot of places, but not everywhere. And in some places, such as in Seoul, that didn't really translate in the local context, and so instead they declared a natural disaster, which made more sense for them around air quality. And air quality is obviously a huge issue in cities like Seoul that are very big and continue to grow. And so that got a lot of traction with their citizens. In GCOM, we are trying to work with all of our stakeholders to bring together how we help cities deliver on these declarations of emergency that they have, so that they can actually have a powerful way forward by working in the local context with their own citizens and with their own city governance structure. What they are finding is that they have to get the attention of national governments and other stakeholders and citizens to engage and really start to draw attention to the fact that cities are one of the main focuses because people live there, so many people live there. In the future, it's predicted that even more people start migrating to cities, and there needs to be an investment from the national government and other resources and support in order for cities to be able to act and take action. So a declaration of a climate emergency is the very first step in a process to highlight a charged issue and something that's facing the city and the citizens. And the next steps are to use the resources available to the cities, which the Global Covenant tries to put forth in a process that is standardized across the world so that cities have a path forward on how to not only declare an emergency, but then to take action. And then they would use their stakeholders and city networks that are in the region to help them determine what the best paths forward are for action. So we really would like to see the progression from declaration of emergency to a plan for action, and then to actual implementation of those actions and progress, so that everyone feels that we're not just making a statement and drawing more attention in a political way to an obvious crisis, but actually have a way to follow that crisis through and say, we're doing something about it, our cities care and are taking action, and this is how far they're coming year after year in those actions.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Shannon. We may come back on some of the points that you made. I think the climate emergency needs, obviously, as you clearly said, needs to be put into practice. So how do cities do that when they make the declaration, or city council? What would it actually mean? But let's come to that later on in terms of the session. I would like to move on and give the floor to Mr. Hastings Shikoko, who is a regional director for Africa of the C40. And the C40 is a city network, in particularly focusing on the climate issues. We at ICLE, we work very closely with C40. So, Hastings, it's a pleasure to have you here with us. And from your perspective, and also, the work that you do with the cities, how, and I think Shannon also referred to that as well, the multi-stakeholder approach and bringing in other groups into actually the implementation to ensure also success of the implementation. How do you see that coming in terms of transitioning also to a more profound environmental protection policies, and maybe also in that sense, how does knowledge plays a role into that matter? Hastings, please.
Thank you so much for having me here. And I just want to start by saying that there is no future for the ecology without the people. There is no ecological transition without the people that are affected, the people that are impacted. So in C40, we now are increasingly focusing on citizen engagement. We now are embracing inclusive climate action, because we believe that the ecological transition or the climate emergency requires collective action from all stakeholders. When you look at the climate strikes, when you look at the yellow vest, the Extinction Rebellion, it's just a demonstration that we are not working as a collective. There are some aspirations that are not being addressed. There is a disconnect between policy making and the people that actually are impacted and affected. So this calls for a multi-stakeholder approach to the way we do our things. We should open dialogue with different stakeholders, whether it's the public, private sector, civil society, citizens broadly, especially the youth. When you look at the movement that Greta has managed to mobilize in a very short of time, space of time, basically it is becoming clear that this time is no longer the time of working groups for the youth. It's the time for working groups with the youth. We need to bring everyone together. So for this to happen, we need to build a relationship of trust. We need to approach our work in a manner that is participatory. And when we talk about participatory, we need to depart from participation that is usually characterized by simply tokenism, but really embrace participation where the citizens are co-creators of solutions. And examples like the Talanoa dialogue that has been referenced in most of the conversation and that ICLEI and other partners have been pushing is one such opportunity where we are saying the local voices should be included in the affairs or in the discussions by state actors. So we need to encourage that. I think to me that is important because number one, when you involve the citizens, it means that whatever solutions that we have for this ecological transition do relate to the context. So it's not just a top-down, but it's actually, we are having solutions that actually speak to the specific context where change needs to happen. We don't live in a homogeneous world, so we need to appreciate that diversity. When you actually involve local government as stakeholders, it basically recognizes the fact that local governments or local authorities are closer to where that change needs to happen, and they are the first responders, and state actors cannot just work alone. When we engage the private sector, we are recognizing that the climate emergency or the ecological transition is unprecedented. We are really having dynamics of urbanization under the backdrop of climate change that has never happened before, and we need new insights, new innovation, new thinking out of the box. We can't do that alone. We need these stakeholders to help us think through that. So in closing, this requires knowledge sharing, this requires data, this requires information exchange, and we need to ensure that the platforms for that are available. We need to make sure that players that facilitate knowledge sharing, like the city networks, ICLEI, UCLG, C40, Cities Alliance, are able to empowered enough to be able to facilitate that, the role of the media. But most importantly, we need to also recognize the place for big data. We need to depart from traditional ways of information sharing and try to explore the opportunities that big data presents in terms of informing the stakeholders on what we need to do. So we should learn from Cambridge Analytica, much as it ended the way it ended, but it demonstrated that there are other ways of informing citizens, there are other ways of capturing data that can influence change.
Thank you very much, Hastings. I'm going to turn now to Mr. Hermenio Celso Fernandez, who is the mayor of Caleta de São Miguel and the vice president of the National Association of Municipalities of Cape Verde. Now, Hermenio is going to speak in Portuguese, but I think that our colleagues from UCLG will help in terms of translation subsequently, I think, into English, and then it goes further. Okay.
To Spanish.
So, Hermenio, you definitely in Cape Verde, one of the most striking processes that are ongoing is, of course, the impacts and the risks of sea level rising. And how do you see that impact?
How do you see this impact as a risk? What is the pressure that it's putting on your way of working? And how do you think of ecological, environmental protection in future? Cape Verde has defined clear policies for protecting the oceans. And has adopted structural measures with that in view for for making the economy more dynamic and adopt these measures, to officially adopt these measures while we focus particularly on the climate transition policies.
The government has adopted policies for the blue economy.
So the government has adopted blue economy policies, and these measures are intended to guarantee a sustainable development
In the management of the submarine
for the management of underwater resources. Cape Verde suffers from 2 droughts, and it's a country that is surrounded by the sea and has very little land. And Cape Verde has now got a much more dynamic marine environment in order to make sure that there's sustainable development. And there's a lot of potential in the eco-marine systems.
The national government is allocating resources for protection of the environment in local government.
The national government has signed documents for the protection of environment at a local level.
Structural
And is financing structural programs and more resilient policies in the country. Is anyone listening to the English? Other tasks that have been carried out on natural resources aim to ensure better quality of life to improve the blue economy policies and also to promote a sustainable tourism. Cape Verde has an enormous potential and fantastic opportunities in the sea for its economic development. The government is promoting a big demonstration during the Week of the Ocean, second edition of the Week of the Ocean, which is an international event which numerous people will attend.
A necessidade da proteção dos oceanos, ou seja, com também a biodiversidade e a sua interligação com o crescimento humano.
There will be debates on climate change, its impact on natural resources and economic development.
Tem uma forte ligação com o objetivo de desenvolvimento sustentável.
We also see that the protection of oceans is directly linked to economic development.
O oceano, ou seja, os nossos mares, têm sido uns pilares para o crescimento económico do país.
Our oceans have always been the most important areas for economic development in the country.
Também o turismo, sobretudo do sol e praia, tem sido uma alavanca para o crescimento
on the promotion of international seminars and various manifestations and the promotion of sustainable tourism. Is anyone listening to the English out there? Anyone at all?
The main priority for the country these days. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mayor Hermenio Celso Fernandez, to give that insight of how your country, but also at local government level, how you are tackling the issues of the oceans and sea rise levels. It looks like when I listen to you that the country and the cities in particular, the communities, take that challenge as almost an opportunity to enhance your ways of working on the environment and ecology. So thank you very much for giving us those insights, and we'll be happy to come back to you also with some questions. I would now like to move on to another colleague, Mayor Sefiani from Chefchaouen. And Mayor Sefiani, you also in your city, you look into consumption and production paradigms who may or may not influence the way of how you are responding to ecological and environmental protection issues and challenges. So I would just like to hear from you, if you could just give a bit of some examples of how you're doing that in your city, but then also maybe elaborate how you could think how that can be scaled up, because that is basically what we will need to do in all our urban areas, is to look really into our consumption and production patterns and trying to change these. So if you could maybe highlight that piece for us here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gino. I will switch to French. Donc, merci beaucoup, Gino. Effectivement, les villes, ils jouent un rôle important.
Cities play a very important role in the sustainable development. And in my case, we adopted a certain number of practices and initiatives at the local level in order to promote consumption and production which is controlled and correct and respects the environment. A very important initiative that we set up was that we are surrounded by two natural parks, a national and a regional park. So the environmental questions are very important for us, and civil society has done a lot of things and carries on doing a lot of things for that. Can you hear me all right in English? Is it okay? Can you just lift your hands if you can hear me? Thank you. So it's what we call the Mediterranean diet, which is the Mediterranean gastronomy, and that's putting value on our agricultural products. And we were recognized as being the we were the heritage of humanity with other European cities, because we do a good production, and we've got a very green system, and we use local products, and so we use local recipes. We don't have any fast food in our country. So that's a very good thing, because we look after consumption and we look after our local products and valorize them. And another focus is on sustainable energy. We set up the first center in Morocco, which is about information on energy, and its main role is to advise people, children, school children, men and women, on how to use energy in a way that is economic and use renewable energies. And it's a whole program that we've set up for the whole year, and this little team is working with civil society and giving practical advice on how to use energy, sustainable energy. So that's very important. And as regards participation, we've created a participatory council for sustainable development and climate. And and we have instruments that give us advice, and we do strategic planning with them at middle term and long term planning, in order to see what tomorrow's cities will look like. There are local leaders, professionals, representatives of civil society, representatives of decentralized local government, and we all work together in order to build our present and our future. And this participatory committee or council also participated with us to organize a carnival of climate and sustainable development. It's a festive occasion with participation of school children and civil society in order to promote respect for nature and the environment and climate change. And I think that in the cities we play a very important role in this to awareness raising. We are locally elected. We represent the citizens in a very democratic manner. So we are very close to the citizens, and we need to use the potential that we have, which is our closeness to the people, our legitimacy, in order to start to launch a campaign, not just a local or national campaign, but a world campaign, which is emanating from the cities in order to promote ecology, biodiversity, climate. And I think that the national network, like Global Covenant of Mayors and so on, we can all together work together and cooperate in order to launch this international campaign via the internet and any other means. But I think we really need to put ourselves in the first place of awareness raising of citizens throughout the world, and we need to federate ourselves. And we, as legitimate representatives of citizens, can do this very well.
Highlighting how you think we can scale up a change in our patterns, in particular when it comes to our consumption and production patterns. Thank you. I'd like to turn to Stephen Bland, climate change and urban planning consultant for the urban planning and design branch of UN Habitat. Stephen, welcome. Mayor Safiani already said, sensibilizing and awareness raising, reaching out to citizens and engage with citizens is a necessity when we look into our ecology for the future. So I'm going to turn to you in particularly with regard to urban planning and how you would think that the ways of how cities are being planned and the traditions that we have had, how should these be potentially being enhanced by taking in, for example, engagement with citizens or residents, habitants. So if you maybe could highlight a little bit more on pro-people planning and how can that contribute to a ecology for the future?
Very much. Yeah, thank you to the panelists. Thank you for your insights so far. And I spend my working life at the sort of interface between climate change and urban planning. UN Habitat's mandate is largely revolving around urban planning, and I sit in the climate change planning unit. And I think we've made a lot of progress, but sometimes it feels like we have a lot of guidelines, a lot of tools, a lot of policies being changed by cities and local governments, also at national government level, and yet you sort of take a step back from the day-to-day and you think, oh, this still seems like a lot of work to be done. And the words transformation and innovation, we use them a lot, but how do we unlock those kind of things? And to share an anecdote, I was at the South African Green Building Council conference a number of years ago, and there was a presentation from a chap who wrote a book called Cradle to Cradle. And he, sort of all these buildings, people were there expecting this presenter to talk about reducing emissions and getting to net zero. And instead he said, you know what, you guys in the buildings, in the sustainable buildings industry, you're talking a load of rubbish. He said, all you want to do is get less, do less bad. He said, I want to imagine urban planning, urban design that creates positive outcomes, positive goods, that does more good, a sort of net positive outcome. And he likened a building to a tree. He said a tree doesn't do less of anything. It only does more of everything. It produces more abundance, more flowers, more seeds, and then its waste products are taken up by the soil, regenerated into more waste that is then used by other animals. So he was using the analogy of ecology, if we're talking about an ecology of cities, to say to imagine what it would be like if our human-designed systems acted and behaved in the way of, in this example, the humble tree. And for me, this is you may think I'm going off on a complete tangent, but the point I'm making here is that sometimes if we're approaching an ecology of a city, we need to take a step back and think in new ways. And one of those ways, I think, is about circular thinking, the circular economy, about long-term thinking, and about systems thinking. And so when we bring that back, those three kind of shifts in the way we think about these issues, when we take them back to urban planning, we can see practically how we might do something differently. I'll take the example of eThekwini yesterday shared that they had had 1 in 50-year floods in the last 2 years in the city. And so this is profound and rapid change from a climate change perspective. And so if we look differently at that issue from an urban planning perspective, and if we were thinking differently, if we were thinking in the way of the tree, what would we do? Well, we would immediately prevent the building of any kind of infrastructure in areas that were in these floodlines, not based on our previous floodline projections, but based on up-to-date climate data as best as we can. That doesn't happen a lot because we either don't have the data or people aren't aware that it exists. But for me, that would be a way in which we did urban planning differently, which responded to the urgency of the problem, but also thinking about it in a new way, recognizing that we can't have nature over here and our building over here, but recognizing that these systems are entirely interrelated. So this is one point I'd like to make. And secondly, when it comes to urban planning, I think we have the foundations. There are principles embedded in the way that UN Habitat and others try and promote urban planning, which I think could lead us to the direction of an ecological city. And one of those relates to participatory methods of planning. And we are, and particularly inclusive ones. So just 2 quick examples on that. The first one is using and Hastings alluded to it a little bit, is using new technologies and approaches to include people in the planning process. So we have a partnership with Ericsson looking at mixed reality applications where we use things like virtual reality. We use technologies like Microsoft's block-by-block approach, where you bring people together and they, in the block-by-block approach, ordinary people with no urban planning or design background can use this software to basically design the urban space using these basically computer-guided blocks. So it looks kind of blocky. It's not an articulate visual depiction, but it's a way of getting everyone involved in the planning process. And we have numerous projects around the world where using that technology has then led to the project a commitment from the local government to actually implement the design of its citizens for a new public space. And these tools, although they haven't been applied widely in pursuit, I would say, of an ecological city, can absolutely be used in that way. And then lastly, when we talk about participatory approaches to planning, Habitat is increasingly focusing on the resilience of low-income settlements, of the urban poor. And we have a new initiative, a partnership initiative with many partners on this panel and others, called Building the Climate Resilience of the Urban Poor. And this is very much about recognizing the climate risks fall disproportionately on those who are already in an unstable economic or social situation, and that there is a massive responsibility for agencies working on climate change to address those people first. And so the Building Climate Resilience of the Urban Poor initiative puts the urban poor at the center of the process, uses participatory data like vulnerability mapping, which uses people's knowledge, their layperson's knowledge of the local environment to inform urban planning approaches. This is a big initiative that we launched at the New York Climate Summit. We're now in a big fundraising stage for that. And I think that's a sort of an example of an application of an urban planning approach which focuses on ecology and those that are most affected by things like climate change and have a lot of promise for the future. So, thanks.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I think we're going to talk a little bit further even on the issue of participatory approaches and involving, engaging also residents into this debate. And I'd like to move to Mayor Ghanshyam Pandey of Tulsipur in Nepal. And so, Mayor, from your perspective and in particularly from the city you are leading, how important do you see the human dimension in the ecological transition? And maybe also in how far do we need also human solidarity around the issues of environment and ecology, as there is always some kind of a trade-off that needs to be made. So, Mayor, please.
Okay. Thank you, moderator. All dear distinguished panelists, distinguished participants, greetings from Nepal. And thank you, UCLG, for inviting me to this session and this Congress. And I'm very delighted to hear from the previous panelists on how ecology conservation for the future is important. So, coming to your specific question and what we are practicing in Nepal, and especially in my city, this ecology is directly linked with the human behavior, human beings, human relations. So in that way, so for the ecology conservations, the human solidarity is being most important things for us. And we had a long practice of human solidarity on protecting our ecology, our environment, our forestry since long time. So I'll give some highlights how we did it, because during the 1970s, Nepal is a mountainous country, and basically it was forested. But when in 1970s, this global crisis was, there was huge deforestation, and lots of ecological crises came out. And there was a big discussion how we can protect our ecology, and there are a lot of efforts has been done. lot of plantation was taken, but no plant or lots of planted tree was not grown. And there was a question, why does plant grow? Many people think that plant or tree grow in land, but that's not true. Because tree need to have a love with the society. Then the strategy was turned out when the local communities mobilize on plantation, protection of forest, and conservation of forest, then our ecology has changed. Now, because of this huge mobilization of the local communities in management of the forest, now Nepal has increased like 500,000 hectare forest, increased forest area. Not only increase in forest area, but also increase the regeneration that the grey mountain was converted into the green mountains. So this is all because of the local community participation on tree plantation, conservation of resources, and this is being very important. So that's Nepal is known as a country of community forestries. Now there are 22,000 community forestries protecting 2 million hectares of forests, and they are doing better way. Even in my city, I have 110 community forest users group. They are protecting this forest, environment, and ecology. So the human solidarity, even if you see to the local action for the communities, having local peoples, indigenous peoples, if they get a right to protect and manage these resources, they do better way. That has clearly we seen in the ground level. Second, not only the protection and conservation of resources, so ecology is beyond the protection of also. So this environmental crisis, as previous panelists said, that because of the climate change, there are a lot of threats are coming in the local level. Those climate change is a global issues, but the impact is seen in the local level. So drought is going on. More different kind of disease are in the local peoples are facing. Poor peoples are having, their life is very difficult. In this situation, that my municipality has taken a strategy how to deal with these climate change issues. What strategy we have to move forward. One strategy we have started to mobilize local communities, indigenous peoples for utilizing the bioresources instead of plastic, instead of other kind of the products. For example, we have done support for the lip plates. That plates is going to substitute the plastic plates. Paper cups is going to change the plastic cups. So that has a small action we have taken at the local level, but that has a multiple impact on environment and ecology. So other thing is that at the local level we mobilize the people in a both way, in a protection and conservation of resources through the different campaign. Like we have the Green Tulsipur, Clean Tulsipur campaign. We mobilize the hundreds of youth and children and elder people to involve them to participate this whole campaign. And we have run the campaign like a birthday plantation. Many people started this birthday celebration by lighting candle or having a cake. But we changed the style. If you want to have the green birthday, please come us with. We have allocated the places for the plantation. You bring tree, or if you are living in New York, you want to celebrate your birthday with a plantation, you send money to us and we plant tree in the name of your birthday. So that's type of campaign that we have started, and it has really a big result of greening our cities. Similarly, We are encouraging the local peoples reduce the use of the plastics, use of the non-degradable resources. We are encouraging peoples to use the more bio resources. So that has make us to make our city clean. And finally, I think the big issue of how to deal with the climate change is one of the biggest issues. It has global discussion is going on, but it seems to me that has not catch a good direction. But we try to having local actions. So from my experience, what I see that if you want to solve this climate change crisis, we have to change our political, ecological systems. We have to change our business as usual. If you are doing same thing, and if you want to get a new thing, that's not possible. So change in this all the behavioral, political, economic systems that more have a bio-based economy that can help to solve the problem. And finally, I would like to again reiterate the importance of the mobilization of local communities, indigenous peoples, for the protection of forests, environment, and ecology that has much better result than without having their participation. So I would like to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mayor. Thank you. I'll turn to our last intervenant of this session here, Mr. Aromar Revi, the founding director of the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. And Aromar, so I think it has been said already or alluded also by a number of our panelists here. Obviously, how human beings are developing, this has an impact on how our ecology is developing. And now there are ways we can look at it from a negative impact that we as humans have, but also maybe as a positive impact. What can we do to enhance our nature and actually work more in harmony with nature and therefore enhance our ecology of the planet at large? Obviously, we, independently from a number of crises that we are having, such as climate change, and to which we have to act upon, we also have a rapid urbanization happening in most of the parts of the world, and so this is aggravating even. So the ways of how we also ourselves develop is influencing our environmental development. So could you just maybe and if possible, give us some recommendations on where you would see how can we bring these potential conflicting discussions together and to advance best. Aromar, please.
Thank you. About a year ago, I think about a year ago we produced, I co-led a report which in a sense created a lot of the ripples which you're hearing today. So I'm one of the lead authors of the 1.5C report, which I think it's not produced last year. Yes, give me the mic. We produced the IPCC 1.5 report about a year ago. And in a sense, to answer the question that Gino talked about, we talked about many things. We know what the story is. When we started in Rio in 1992, we were 1 degree above the pre-industrial average. We spent 25 years fighting about Kyoto and many other things. Bali failed, Copenhagen failed. We completely reversed the paradigm as far as climate is concerned, going from top down to bottom up, which is why cities are so important, because cities represent how the bottom up can be consolidated. But in those 25 years, we added half a degree. So now, we've gone from 0.5 to 1 degree. And at the current point of time, because it is business as usual, we're adding 0.2 degrees every decade. So we are going to hit 1.5 unless we really change around the world in maybe 15 years' time or so. So after we produced the 1.5 report, the first thing that we did, and I think many colleagues here were involved in that process, GCOM was involved, Stephen was involved in that process, we produced a summary for urban policymakers with ICLEI, with UCLG. And why was that? Because we found that cities were the pivot around which this change could take place? For two reasons. The first reason is that much of what we see in terms of economic development, in terms of job opportunities, in terms of all the human consolidation is happening in cities across the world. But at the same time, cities also concentrate risk. They concentrate poverty, they concentrate conflict, they concentrate risk. So if you want to address both those things simultaneously, cities are where the action has to happen. But there is a fundamental challenge, and that is that urban areas do not produce or manage the critical ecosystem services that we need to be able to survive. It's quite simple. We know that. It's common sense. Cities cannot produce all the food that they require. They cannot produce all the water, whether it's in Nepal or Brazil or in Morocco, wherever it is. So we have to take a territorial approach. And I think this is really the most important thing that that the urban community has to do. It's not only about cities themselves, but it's cities and regions together. So I think that is a fundamental way of reorganizing both governance and ways of thinking, which we are not very successful at the moment, but we really have to change across the world. We have to think territorially, whether it's food security, water security, or energy security. One of the key things the 1.5 report said, 50% reduction in emissions by 2030, going to net zero by 2050. What does that mean? That means we have to electrify all our urban systems and move them to renewables. You can't do all of that by putting rooftop solar. You have to do stuff in the region. So all of these processes have to come together. So I think territorial development is probably the most central process. So we do really have to look at the balance between rural and the urban, whether it's Nepal or India, which is, they're both 2/3 urban, 1/3, 2/3 rural and 1/3 urban, or other places which are 80% urban. We have to look at that continuum. That's, I think, the most critical thing. The second thing is, this is going to happen in our lifetimes. In 87, the Brundtland Report talked about our children. I mean, our children, people who were born, the millennials are alive just now, fine. This is going to happen in our lifetimes. What we do today is going to impact us in the next 15 or 20 years. The difference between 1.5 and 2 in cities is 300 million people going to be affected by heat waves. The number of people going to be food insecure going to move from 30 million to 350 million. Okay, in just 0.5 degrees. So in a sense what we're saying is every 0.1 degree makes a difference. And we have to start now. And the place to start is in urban areas around exactly the systems we're talking about. But in most of the urban areas that we're going to see developing, in parts, much of Africa and Asia, the key issue for us is informality. The key issue for us is vulnerability. So this is completely tied in with the development agenda. One of the critical ways of dealing with adaptation, with dealing with the impacts of climate, or even with dealing with food security, is actually to make sure that basic services, whether it's food or energy or water or education and health, are available. So we have to lift the floor of systems. So thinking territoriality, making sure that there's universal access, which is effectively the SDGs in some senses. Now the key question for us is, cities are actually doing this. Every mayor is doing this, handling this process, but we are disempowered. And one of the critical things in dealing with that disempowerment is not only political power and that equation, partnerships between national and local governments, but the fact that we have to be resourced properly to make this happen. If you're handling 2/3 of the SDGs, at least at the target level, and you're getting 1% of the resources, it's impossible for anybody to deliver something in the next 20 or 30 years. So I think the core issue is about where resources are, where the human resources are, where the financial resources are. And it's a coming together of these three things in which we will actually see some critical action, because we do not have the time to do each of these things separately. We have to do all of them together.
Thank you very much, Aramar. On also in particular on that last point, I think looking at it from a local leader, obviously, it's not only a question about time, but it's actually, there is no need. We need to act on all of it at the same time. And in most of the responses, local leaders are searching for bringing it together, and they have no message from the international community, we have this convention, we have that convention. They have a message when we look at it holistically and respond on that holistically. I think, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm looking towards my colleagues of UCLG, but I would think we have a couple of minutes that we can use still for questions from the floor to the panelists before we conclude this session. Now, please do stand up if you have questions and just quickly introduce yourself and then appoint your question to any of the panelists or to all of them. Yes, my colleague is here with a microphone as well. Yeah, great. So, go ahead. Any questions?
Well, I have been waiting to see this panel for a long time. I'm very happy that it is there, and we are very happy from UCLG to have this structural exchange. For us, it is a structural exchange. It's not about only what are we doing today, as our Ubuntu advisor, Mr. Aromarevi, was saying. It's something we have to do today for tomorrow. And we all know that. It's not, I'm not adding nothing new. My question is, how can we ensure that we are not talking only about climate, but seeing it as rather a transversal question that is crossing all SDGs? It is, global agendas are all about this. It is about not raising that much degrees, because at 2 degrees we are done. But how can we ensure that we have a structural action with all of us, with all the institutions, that is transversal and ensuring that we have something that we can call ecology in 10 or 15 years?
Right. Who would like to respond? Very shortly. Aroma, you want to kick it off? Yeah, go ahead.
The SDG agenda was politically negotiated, and some of us get stuck at SDG 11. Actually, the urban SDG agenda is across all the SDGs. You cannot have sustainable cities without having water, without having life above land, without having SDG 12. It doesn't work, because this is what provides us the basic services that we require and run. The challenge is making the connection territorially and changing the mandates of local and regional government to become the first responders. We're seeing that happen politically, but the resourcing is going to be the key issue as far as we're concerned. And it's not a question only of the future. For a lot of people in the world today, it's a question of now. Food security, water security, flooding, it's something that's happening now in many places. We saw it yesterday in Durban.
Air quality, for example.
Yeah, air quality, it's critical. So it is a cross-cutting question, and they're all interacting. That's exactly the question, 40 years ago, Los Angeles could deal with the air quality problem on its own. But now in many parts of Asia, you can't do that. It's tied into emissions, it's tied into food security. It's all connected. Mm-hmm. So we have to transform stuff, and we have to do it very quickly. And that's why cities are important, because that's where innovation happens. That's where we can see the cycles working very quickly. But we have to get the space to make that happen.
Hastings.
Yeah. I believe also, just to add to that, that's a very good point. And I believe that in building the case for action towards this ecological transition, our analysis should, of course, highlight the impact of climate change, of course, for different sectors, but most importantly also underscore the interdependencies between sectors. That once one sector, whether it's the energy sector, is hit by climate hazard, there is a kind of like interdependency that actually kicks in, and as other sectors are also affected. Once our analysis based on really science and data can demonstrate that, we'll be able to build the case that climate change is a collective responsibility, and we can bring down the silos and the walls that separate us in addressing climate change.
Thank you very much, Hastings. We would like to respect the time that also our excellent interpreters are spending with us. So I would like to come to an end and conclude this session with your permission, in respect also to our colleagues of the interpretation services. But ladies and gentlemen, I would like just to say from my perspective that I was delighted to listen to this panel. I think the issues of an ecology of the future are indeed very much on the table. Climate change is one of those topics that, of course, we need to address them by priority, as they have a global impact with extraordinary local differentiated impacts. But having said that, yes, we need to look into how can we build an ecology for the future in all its aspects, and so that the not only nature but also humans are, of course, surrounded by an ecology that is enhancing us, and that we can, work with, take benefit from, but also can give back to that in order to maintain it in the future for our next generations. So, with all due respect, I would like to conclude this session. I would like to thank very much our interpreters. I would like to thank the colleagues of UCLG for having set up this session. I would like to ask you all a big applause for our panelists who have been contributing to this session. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.